And we can now move directly into our next presentation by Dr. Larkin S McReynolds.
Yes, yes, hello. Thank you, Faith and Will, for that really great presentation. I think it's very exciting, the work you're doing, and I am glad to hear that it'll be expanding. Let me share my screen. Can everyone hear me?
Dr. Reynolds, please allow me to introduce you while you're sharing your screen.
Sure.
Dr. Reynolds is a member of the Global Psychiatric Epidemiology Group, where she's involved in the identification of youth's mental health and substance use behaviors, particularly among those involved with the juvenile justice system. She's responsible for overseeing all Columbia University Mailman School of Public Health Department of Epidemiology MPH students, master's thesis. Dr. Reynolds is currently leading a national investigation of the psychological consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic on the mental health of college students. She's a co-investigator on the Columbia University of Vienna Research in Injury and Trauma Training Program, an assistant professor of clinical epidemiology, Mailman School of Public Health. Please welcome Dr. Larkin S McReynolds. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you. So I don't know if many of you or all of you were able to enjoy Dr. Judah Balaz's special keynote speech yesterday, where she talked about her interest in looking at non-suicidal self-injury as part of her research focus and her clinical focus. So if you were, this is kind of the next step in incarcerated youth. And in a way, this is another clinical sample. It's a selected group, those that get into the juvenile justice system deep enough, not just that they had involvement, but that they've actually been adjudicated into the system. So keep that in mind as we go through. So first, I wanted to establish kind of the public health issue related to non-suicidal self-injury and justice-involved youth. In the United States, we have over 1 million youth that are involved, either arrested, stopped, go into probation. But even so, that's a pretty hefty sum of the adolescent population in the United States. Even more so, we have about 60,000 that are under the age of 18 that are currently incarcerated. So we do have another, I think it's around 30,000 that are housed in adult for very serious crimes. So we're getting around 100,000 youth per year. And so I want you to appreciate the volume of the need. So we know that there have been elevated rates of quote unquote self-injury, and we'll get to this in a minute of how that's defined, that have been noted in incarcerated populations, even in adults, but that's also been noted in adolescents in secure care or incarcerated jails or prisons. And the higher rate of self-injury for this forensic samples is really consistent with the overburden of psychiatric disorder or mental health issues, behavioral health issues, as well as the loaded amount of trauma exposure. In most of our, we have an archive of over nearly 10,000 youth in the United States, and the average of quote unquote traumas that they've been exposed to is around 4 to 5. So they're coming with a loaded things that could put them at risk for non-suicidal self-injury. So before we started this study, there were kind of two main things that were, kind of troubling us related to the methodology. And one, it was how people were defining self-injury. Was it, something that was with the intent to die, or was it just an infliction of a skin? So there was quite a range from less severe to more severe. that was really complicating when you read the literature of, okay, what is even the prevalence of this? And that was really brought to the forefront when the DSM-5 made for a call for more investigation in the topic of non-suicidal self-injury. So that was behavioral actions that were put someone at risk, but there was no intent to die. So one of the other things that they added was the frequency of which this occurred. And I think in the DSM-5, they called it had to have happened on 5 or more days in the past year. That was quite arbitrary. There was a lot of discussion in putting out the DSM-5 of really how they felt like they needed to put some type of time limit, that it's not over a lifetime, but it was over in a specified period of time to call for action. So another part of the problem of reading the literature before we started this study was there was the question of really the gender differences. You know, some we saw that, and I'll show in a minute, you know, that there were no gender differences, some there were, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But I think as Judith Balaz talked about in her keynote speech, the key or whether or not you find gender differences is about the sample you have and their intrinsic comorbidities that come involved with that. But, you know, also going into this study is we were really interested, are the risks for suicidal self-injury, are they the same than they would be for the non-suicidal? So just to put things in perspective, we were looking at community rates. So these are adolescents that are in just the general community, not selected into a clinical sample or a juvenile justice sample. And we were reading that, you know, it's approximately 35%. But when you really read the literature and you thought about how are they defining self-harm, whether it be a narrow construct, the more narrower construct, it was ranged lower between 14 and 22. And if you looked at suicidal self-injury, that's around 9 to 10%. 10%. So when we looked at studies of community, adolescents have sometimes reported higher rates for females. But then when you looked at a meta-analysis, which is a meta-analysis, a study is of many studies, that they indicated definitely there have been higher rates among females. But then we also found 2 other meta-analyses that said there were, you know, less gender differences. But then when we tried to find just studies done among incarcerated youth, we found that the gender differences tended to disappear. Although there were some that did find higher rates among females. Also noted when we did our review of the literature is that there seemed to be over the past decade, or at this time now 2 decades, a secular trend toward no gender differences. And what that was more related to an elevation among non-suicidal self-injury among the males. So what we have commonly been identified as risk for self-injury in adolescents have been internalizing conditions such as major depressive disorder or depressed mood, PTSD related to earlier trauma exposures, and then externalizing behaviors related to conduct disorder and marijuana abuse or dependence. And I won't get into kind of the theories that are support why people commit non-suicidal self-injury, but they generally are harbored in a want and a need to feel alive and feel real. In adolescents, this is usually engendered if they have not a feeling of control of their environment or their moods, and so they self-inflict to have that feeling of control. So what we chose to do in closing these gaps that we identified in the literature is that we wanted to examine the prevalence and correlates of non-suicidal self-injury in incarcerated male and female youth. We wanted to look about the contributions of their internalizing mood disorders, as well as their conduct, behavioral, externalizing substance use features. But we also wanted to add a history of both sexual and non-sexual physical violence. And given that among adolescents, cutting is the most prevalent method of non-suicidal self-injury, we wanted to also examine this and how, whether or not just it differed or did not differ from just an overall perspective of self-injury, non-suicidal self-injury. So we partnered with the Illinois Department of Juvenile Justice, which is one of the largest juvenile justice centers in the United States. And what we did is we took all new intakes into 2 secure facilities, one serving each gender, and we gave them a self-reported computerized diagnostic interview called the Voice Disc, which assessed over 20 different disorders in 4 diagnostic clusters. And when I talk about clusters, that means it was the mood disorders, the anxiety disorders, disruptive behavior, as well as substance use disorders. And so those are assessed in not only the past month, because we wanted it for a clinical purpose for kids getting screened in, but also it asked about lifetime and recent suicidal behavior. So as part of this diagnostic instrument is that they also, it's part of the anxiety cluster, is the PTSD module, which asks 8 different questions of exposure to different traumatic events, 2 of which are related to having experienced forced sexual activity, and those that have been beaten or attacked or threatened by a weapon was considered to be non-sexual physical assault. So also as part of this intake assessment, that we asked them to, we asked the youth to consent to providing information on what the instrument we developed here at Columbia, the VISA, which is Voice Index of Self-Injurious Actions. So the VISA inquires about nature and frequency of lifetime and past year self-harm. But then at the end of it, so that's cutting, burning, eating, drinking something other than food, drugs, medicine, biting oneself, hitting oneself, picking at their skin, and putting something under their skin. And so for each behavior that they endorsed, it's a gated instrument that then it went on to ask about lifetime, and then it asks about past year, frequency, and other characteristics such as hiding. Did you had to go get medical assistance for the behavior? So just to give you a perspective of the demographics of our sample, is the first column here is just everyone, and it, you know, so we have about 30% females, which was larger than any other non-suicidal self-injury study in incarcerated youth that we had found. But when we were looking at just the prevalence of the characteristics that were associated with lifetime non-suicidal, as well as lifetime cutting, we saw that clearly what stands out and where the asterisks are the things that are most associated with the non-suicidal self-injury. So we see having any disorder is almost 70% of people who reported non-suicidal self-injury in their life had one or more disorders, particularly related to major depression, conduct, substance use, as well as having an overlap of having a prior suicide attempt, whether recently in the past 4 weeks, as well as a lifetime attempt, about a quarter of them. So you can see there's not a direct overlap between suicidal self-injury, a lifetime attempt, versus the non-suicidal. But then interesting, we saw that there was a high loading for having experienced a forced sexual activity, as well as a non-sexual physical assault, about 60%. So when we look at the characteristics of people who reported non-suicidal self-injury, I think it's important in what's highlighted here in the circles, and I have it first in the column as overall, but then by the genders, is really thinking about that amount of self-injury, non-suicidal self-injury that really required medical attention. So there's obviously a lot of trying to hide the behavior at about 38.5%. In the overall, but then about almost over a quarter actually required medical attention for that. So this is another concern regarding non-suicidal self-injury, is that the frequency of which they're doing it, that there could be accidental suicidal behavior. So when we put all of these into a regression, what we call a multivariate logistic regression, predicting who is more or less likely to commit non-suicidal self-injury, is I think what's important to notice here is that we see in the overall column, we see some things, you know, standing out, but then they're accentuated when we split it, stratified by gender. And here, just as we kind of expected, that having a major depressive disorder was very much associated with, you know, almost 4 times more likely in the males, if they reported a depressive disorder, were more likely to report non-suicidal self-injury. And that, you know, the lifetime, having a prior lifetime attempt actually increased the odds that they would also report a lifetime non-suicidal self-injury. But I think what's interesting is the noting the gender differences in the type of experienced forced traumatic exposure. So forced sexual activity among the females, if they reported forced sexual activity, were almost 5 times more likely to engage in a lifetime non-suicidal self-injury. And then among the males, that, which is quite frequent, non-sexual physical assault, is still increased the odds that they would engage in non-suicidal self-injury by 3-fold. So I think that, you know, our primary findings of our study were finding the rates of non-suicidal self-injury reported here were a little at the higher range than compared to, you know, community counterparts of adolescents. The present report really didn't find a big gender differences. However, we did find that the reflected differences in their comorbidities. So where we saw that the males here, that it was, you know, having a prior attempt was the same for both genders. What really stood out, if you have a male that's incarcerated with a major depressive disorder, they may be more likely to be at risk for non-suicidal self-injury. And then we also saw the gender differences in the trauma. So really related is that there really needs to be a, well, I think the implications here. So what do we do with this information? I think foremost in the United States now, which is really something that changed in the past 20 years, is that they do a standardized assessment for suicidal behaviors and intent upon entry to any juvenile facility. But what's more important is that they need to also be doing a systematic identification of non-suicidal self-injury. And that part of this standardized assessment should be when I say standardized assessment, it should be a checklist, a standard set of questions, versus leaving it to a probation officer or an intake facility officer who may not feel like doing it on Monday or a Friday night. So that if you have this in place, that it's systematic for every kid, no matter when they come in the system. And that this part of this assessment should also include a range of trauma history. which we found to be very associated with the behavior of non-suicidal self-injury. So I think also implores, given that we found kind of not so much of a difference in the overall rates of non-suicidal self-injury, is that it needs to be done for women and as well as males in the facilities. So that's kind of the short and skinny of my talk, and I would welcome any questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McReynolds. Questions? Go ahead.
Thanks for your presentation, quite interesting. Apart from this academic, great academic value of a study, were any of the results disaggregated to increase one-on-one or increase projects or programs to address the issues that we find?
Could someone repeat the question closer to the mic so I could hear?
For your presentation.
Oh, thank you. Now I can hear.
Apart from the great value academically of your study, did any of your results disaggregated to spur or to increase work within the prison system based on your results?
Yes, actually, we now the facility that we worked with in Illinois, that they have gone on, and this was I think for the past decade, that they have gone on and included the standardized instrument, the Visa, which is free for anybody to use. They've continued to do it, and now we have actually, I think, 20 major facilities in Texas and in Florida who are using the instrument. And part of the instrument is it's really for a clinical boots on the ground. What do you do when someone comes into your what they call a juvenile assessment center? The first part of intake is that it allows a printout so that the intake officer can know immediately if there's anybody in, to do level of service and care upon entry. So like I said, I'm happy to share the instrument with anybody who wants. It's easy. It's a computerized assessment and allows for a printout right then.
Something you're interested in?
Yes, we know.
Good morning, Doctor. So I listened to the presentation and I tried to compare it to the environment in which I work in the Caribbean, but more so Guyana. So I would like the instrument. So could you guide me as to how I can get the instrument so that
Sure.
we can incorporate it into the Guyana Prison Service?
Sure, I will share my, I think another, somebody else is sharing, but yes, my email is Larkin, LARKIN .McReynolds @nyspi.columbia.edu. It's also in the agenda packet, so feel free to call me and I'll more than happy to share the instrument free of charge.
Thank you very much.